Hello everyone and welcome to another video and part 2 of our series on how to balance strength and endurance training concurrently. A little bit of a whistle stop tour. I'm Fergus Crawley. This is my YouTube channel. If you haven't seen what I've been up to over the past couple of years, then please do have a look. But in short, I balance strength, speed and endurance concurrently, all under this man's guidance, who is Johnny Payne. Whistle stop tour, 2 sentences, go.
I am Johnny Payne. I am Johnny Payne. There's 2 sentences for you. That'll do, won't it? I am Johnny Payne. I have been Fergus' coach now for 4 to 5 years, and yes, we've been working on how to balance not only his strength and endurance, but many others. And I'm qualified to do that by about 18 years worth of practice and an athletic background in the same disciplines, essentially. I'm just too lazy to do it now.
Too old and broken, I think is what he means to say. But if you want a bit more of an in-depth introduction from both of us on what we do at Omnia Performance, then please head back to part 1. You should watch part 1 as it tees this one up really nicely. But what we're going to discuss today is how you can manage your stressors to maximize efficiency when balancing strength and endurance training, and how we do that in terms of considerations for the clients and athletes that we have, and how you can maybe manifest that into your training considerations at home. Anyway, here's a mind map I made earlier. The first mind map I've done since geography GCSE, maybe, perhaps. I don't even know if you did mind maps in geography. Say science. Say science. I'll save it. That was a terrible choice. Anyway, so this, in short, is treat this as our body's stress, and these are all the things that we tend to consider and look at when we monitor what is feeding in and what is feeding out to them. And these things all have an impact on our systemic fatigue, how we respond to things, how we react to things, our training outputs, our work outputs, our productivity, all this holistic considerations that make up a part of how we operate on a day-to-day basis. And as we've got a few professional athletes under our tutelage, but most of them are just everyday people that want to do better things, want to set themselves ambitious goals. So they've got all these things to consider. They can't just completely focus on the training side of things. They need to manage all of these things, consider all of these things, and plan their training accordingly. So in part 1, where we discuss my hybrid training plan and how we've been doing it for 2021, we go into a bit of detail on why adaptability and following a pattern, but not necessarily following the exact letter of that pattern all the time, and being able to adapt and make it malleable as you go is very important. So for a bit more context on that, head to that video. But what we're going to do here is just run through why we consider these things, how they affect us, how they can positively or negatively affect us, and why they need to be considered in the broader consideration sense of hybrid training. So the obvious one that most people will consider first of all is training, because that's what we're talking about. Spoiler. But there is so much more that goes into that impacts this, and as I've said, everything can positively impact our stress or negatively affect our stress, and everything's on this sliding scale, the spectrum that it's up to us as individuals to manage. What we do is we help manage the training, we help manage the nutrition, we help manage the habits and considerations around it. But even as individuals, we get these things wrong in our day-to-day life. You might have seen in my recent YouTube videos, I've been having more alcohol than I normally would because I've been doing a lot of fun stuff with fun people. So I only live once, I'm going to have a drink or 2. But what that will do is it will affect my sleep, which means it will then negatively affect my overall stress, which means that if I'm training at the same capacity as planned, that might put me into a state of stress that will not allow me to adapt effectively. So what we do is we consider all of these things within the context of an athlete's training programming. They feed back to us on how all these elements are going. So for example, just today I've had somebody say that they've got a wedding on the weekend and they're going to be having infinite amounts of beers, to quote. So that means that weekend is semi-written off. I'm not going to say to them, oh, don't drink, because they're just a recreational athlete who wants to better themselves. Far be it from me to tell them what to do in that sense. But with that consideration, we'll adjust the training because the sleep will have been impacted. Their mental health might be impacted because they might have a hangover that makes them question everything they've ever existed for. It might make them wonder what's going on. Adherence to nutrition on a hangover is normally piss poor, and whilst your calorie balance might be great, your micronutrient intake might be poor, which means your overall recovery will be poor, your overall energy will be poor, and therefore your training will be poor. That might mean that you go into Monday really unproductive, and Monday you're going to be struggling to get through a really stressful workload, which means that what would normally take 3 hours takes 6 hours, and therefore you feel behind the rest of the week. That's going to constantly make you stressed, worried about things. Your mental health might suffer, which means your training might suffer, which means your family relationships might suffer, and then all of a sudden we're in this big stress bucket that's starting to overflow. So we look at things very holistically because Your body cannot differentiate stress from one thing and stress to another. It just sees it as stress. And we're looking at systemic stress versus training stress. So what we're trying to do is manage the stresses and the inputs that we prescribe so that our athletes and ourselves as individuals with their own training manage these things, but most importantly acknowledge that the way that we look at these things and interact with these things has an impact on our training. And that's why what I said in video 1 about ego is so important, because if you think, oh, I'm going to go and have 4 beers, I'm going to have a meal out, I'm going to have a late night, sleep really poorly and just sort of eat what I want for a couple of days, that doesn't then mean that you're going to go in and PB your 5k, because your body's going to be in a suboptimal state. So you need to acknowledge and understand that if you're going to do that, there's a bit of a sacrifice you need to make, which probably means you do your 5k at a training pace rather than a max effort pace and save it for another week or something like that. But Johnny has been looking after athletes on this for years and years and years. I've sort of been doing it for 3-4 years now, you've been doing it for 18. So I think insights wise, in terms of having managed a surplus of 1,000 athletes over the years at this point, what are the main things that people tend to get wrong in this space, and why is it so important that we consider these things as a whole?
Well, interestingly, you could pick any one of these and say that this is a common thing that people get wrong. What people tend to get wrong overall are two kind of key elements of that. Is one, not recognizing that this is all part and parcel of the same thing. That this kind of constitutes a human, as opposed to this bit being the part that they're focusing on constitutes the human. And then not really manipulating the others in order to achieve what they want. A great friend of mine described recently, and I believe this is from somebody else, but the different burners on a hob. So we've got 4 different burners on a hob, and we've got a pot here, pot here, pot here, pot here. If we turn one up full blast, and we only have a finite amount of gas underneath, then the rest of them are going to have to be dialed down. Otherwise, we're going to burn out very quickly. Does that make sense as a short, easy analogy? I've butchered somebody else's work there, but the ultimate goal here is to consider that all these different hobs, all these different elements, all these different things that are working for us as well as against us have to be considered as a whole. So, as Fergus has just gone over, and I won't go over it in entirety again, each one of these affects the other. I mean, we could probably draw little lines around here as well. All come back and feed in here. And we have to consider, if we're trying to manage somebody's training process and programming and the outcome to be favourable from that, we have to consider all these things. Now, as coaches, it's not our position to kind of force ourselves, apart from where we've been asked to consider certain things, but we can't, impact this particularly. But if the athlete is cognizant enough through the coaching that we provide, or through simply having a kind of a cognizant approach to this, then meaningful management of this kind of thing actually helps the adaptation of these kind of things, and all this feeds into one systemic overall result. And what we kind of want here, we could grab the pen and write it in, but it'll probably spoil it a little bit. Will be another E and a U here. We can have some U stress, because what we're looking for is to be able to stress the body. Stress is a good thing, as well as a bad thing, isn't it? So we can have negative stress, and if we pour all this stuff into this one big bucket, as Fergus described in the beginning, then it's going to overflow, or like the hobs, it's going to burn out, and we're going to have a problem, because then we're going to have to unpick where it went wrong. Often it's not here.
That is why the pattern is the most important thing, rather than the prescription, and why we're constantly moving. We're not sticking to the letter of the law prescription-wise. It's constantly adaptable and relative to the efficiency of the day.
Yeah, and as you say, if you want to take a trip back in time into video 1 in this series, you'll see how we're piecing this together, and we've kind of referred out to this a little bit. And really, from an athletic perspective, of course, these are the kind of things that we're managing, but it all pours into the same bucket. So this kind of idea of eustress is that if we go back to the training program and we load up a back squat, and you're going to hit for your 250 soon, and we get a 210 on X amount of reps, etc. That's good stress. We want to provoke a positive adaptation from that load, etc. So here we want to provoke positive adaptations from all these different things. We want this kind of stuff to feed in. Even here, this could be an opportunity. Your client at the weekend having a wedding. If we were to kind of try and put a dampener on that, or hamper the ability to get in about that alcohol and enjoy that, then that's actually going to feed into this kind of stress. That all of a sudden, you didn't really entertain my wedding very much. Where were you during?
That's exactly how I've been approaching this personally recently. Is that I've got opportunities to just sort of have a few recreational drinks and enjoy it, and it'd actually make me more uncomfortable trying to take on those situations and just be like, oh no, like being overly dogmatic with me affects my general relationships and my overall mental health. Not because I need booze or anything like that, but just because I don't want to be prohibiting myself for the sake of just dogmatic rules. It's the case of considering everything within its own individual context and not letting this be the only consideration, because it absolutely is not.
No, you're right, it isn't. But where we do have a focus, where we have professional athletes, as you've alluded to, and where we have recreational athletes, and there's not a lot of a difference between how much somebody wants to achieve something just because of their status within that elite board. If we have this as a very key goal, this is something we want to achieve, then we need to manage these other things. The same as within that training program as I described in the video. One, if we want to manage our volume, we want to manage the amount of endurance work we can do, we have to also consider how much strength work we can do and manage it within a holistic kind of viewpoint. And that's what we're talking about here essentially. Although, as I've said, we're not going to kind of step in and manage relationships, etc. But you as an athlete can certainly consider that as being something that will affect your training. Once you've kind of managed that yourself and you've kind of pieced that together and you're able to kind of control those things where necessary, have some time off, make sure that this is kind of prioritised, etc. Naturally, this is going to be a hell of a lot better. Naturally, this is going to be a hell of a lot better. And you may find that because all these things are going positively for you, that your own work situation, if it's not a training one, becomes a hell of a lot easier as well, because the stress is being managed everywhere else. So that ability to spread that stress, similarly as in the training program, that ability to understand where those stresses are. And I think key is to be inclusive and trying to find the right word there, almost mindful anyway of how to manage that kind of stuff.
It's developing self-awareness.
That self-awareness is so you're not saying to yourself no. You're not saying to yourself, oh God, I ruined this, over here because I didn't do this properly. It's okay, so what do we do next? How do we learn? How do we adapt? How do we move forward? If we can consider that all, then we can probably move forward within this kind of eustress situation with everything, I would say.
I think so. I think to put that into some sort of relative context rather than just rambling, the biggest mistakes that we see, the questions we get, so many of the questions we often get on this, the answer is always, it depends. And that's such a cop-out of an answer, but it's because we don't want to dilute the importance of these considerations. And if somebody says to me, look, we had a question earlier, how do I balance CrossFit? How do I balance CrossFit and half marathon training? Completely context dependent. What's your family relationship situation? Do you have 3 kids? Do you have 9 kids? Do you have no kids? What's your workload around work? Are you in a CrossFit gym day in, day out? What's your actual training program at the moment? What's your sort of base level aerobic endurance? All these things require a lot more specific attention because you're working at a limited capacity on each individual discipline. So the majority of questions we get on a day-to-day basis, it's a much more nuanced answer, which is why, sorry to those that always answer them, we don't really have a succinct answer we can give you. And it comes back to that age-old thing, which is in the fitness industry and always has been. There isn't a quick fix to this. It's much more considered, and especially within this context, all these things are largely up to the individual. This is where we come in, and there's some considerations around this, but that's why the ego element's so important, because this is only effective if these things are being considered within that broader context. A second good example is that a lot of people, when I worked in London, for example, you get so many people that have had a brutal day at work. They get in at 8, and I'm thinking, right, what do I want to do? I want to go and absolutely send it on the assault bike and just redline for 45 minutes. What's that going to do? That's going to absolutely surge your training output. You're doing it late at night, which is going to tank your sleep because your heart rate's still going to be up. You're going to be eating late, and then you're going to be, all you're doing is you're solving stress by adding more stress. And if we picture this as a bucket that's constantly going up, if it starts overflowing, you need to scale back on some elements of these, or upend on some micronutrition, or spending more time with family, whatever it is, to bring that back down so it's not overflowing. And that is why we have so many people who are always confused as to why we prescribe so much less work and why am I not doing X amount of speed work, etc., because there's so much building to be done to underpin all of these things, so that when you're in a relative training output, we basically switch on when it's the right time to switch on. And that's why the undulation throughout each microcycle each week, as we referred to in video number 1, is so important. But we can't tell you how to manage all these things. We're not going to tell you today how you should manage this either. But what we can tell you to do is to make sure to consider all these things within the same umbrella of managing your overall stress, and then working around that so that your training considerations relative to your goals, which we'll get onto in terms of specificity, are constantly referring to, calibrating to, and becoming more self-aware about all these things. So it's not thinking, I'm Superman, I'm going to have 6 pints, get no sleep, and then do my training session, look at me. Because all you're doing, if you were going into the week at 0% fatigue, that's not going to be the case, but if you go into the week at 0% fatigue, wanting to get to the end of the week and we're just sort of hitting 99% MRV maybe, that's what we're aiming to do, which is maximum recoverable volume. If you go into your Monday, let's use me as an example, heavy lower body day in sprints, you might use up 20% of the adaptive energy and recoverable volume that you've got for that week by having a big weekend and getting really poor sleep. So whilst your heavy squats and your sprints might feel okay, by the end of the week you won't have any more energy left to give to the big volume sessions that I would normally have prescribed. So you've got to consider everything with its context, and that pretty much covers how we consider the stressors in general terms, isn't it?
Another example that may speak to a lot of people here is one of having children. So I can come to this, very different to yourself. I've got 4 kids, and whenever we have clients working with us, or in my own situation where you have those children, they come along, this goes to hell, this is tested, this goes to hell, and this is tested. And what you tend to do, what people tend to want to do, myself included, is to say, right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to anchor myself to one thing that I know it keeps me being me, and that's training. I'm not going to miss a session, and then I know I'm doing good. And in actuality, as you've just described with your own scenario there, or with your own example rather, is that if you do that, it's the same as going out on the piss, not sleeping well, etc., and it's going to continue for quite some time. But if you consider that bucket, what you can do within this training cycle here, and maybe we'll cover this in a later video, is you can manage the stressors going in here, so you can still attend to training, you can still attend to these things, as long as you're cognizant of how that affects other things. But we can manage the dilution of that training and that recovery by looking into the degradation of certain elements of training. We can say, okay, strength training, your strength capability is going to take 3 to 4 weeks before it actually starts to degrade, in which case, do we need to put in 3 strength days at the moment? Because we don't need to adapt, maybe we just need to hold it whilst you take care of the new child. Another aerobic training would sit roughly within those same parameters. Power training is going to drop off a hell of a lot faster. So if within your training program power is of a priority, we can put in power training once every 2 to 3 days, maybe 3 or 4 days. We can put in strength training just once a week. Aerobic training maybe once a week. Skill training, it might be the thing depending on what we're doing that we keep in there. But that means we can reduce things down to 2, maybe 3 very, very key training sessions that are short, impactful, but very, very relevant, and at least throughout this process you're maintaining, but none of this stress is filling the bucket up. So from a training perspective, we're still doing everything we need, but we've considered all these other things, and this doesn't suffer, this doesn't become a get-out clause, this doesn't suffer, etc., etc. So just easy examples of how we can kind of change all this around to kind of still move forward, or at least hold fast until such times as these things have eased a little bit.
And that is exactly why it's so important to consider specificity and actual prioritisation when it comes to this, because you've touched on things like maintenance, and the degradation of strength takes much longer than we think. You need much, much less volume to maintain strength and hypertrophy, sort of muscle mass, than you would expect, but to build it, it takes a lot more, and that's something that we'll touch upon when we discuss prioritisation and what was the word that I just used? Prioritisation and specificity. So that is part 2. Please remember to like, comment and subscribe. Any questions that you have, please do comment them down below. We will do our best to respond to them with answers that are not "it depends," but we have given you plenty of forewarning on what sorts of question might warrant that response, but it is not because we're trying to be offensive or lazy, it's just context dependent, as we've made clear here. So thank you very much for watching. Make sure to tune in for part 3. If you haven't seen part 1 already, then you're doing this in a weird order. Why would you watch the 2 Towers before you've seen the Fellowship of the Ring? Tune in for the Return of the King. Goodbye.